They built the cage overnight. That was the part the stranger would remember later, not the ambush, not the chains, not the four men who jumped him while he watered Scout at the creek outside of town. The part he'd remember was that someone had built a cage in the middle of the street and waited for someone to put in it. The cage wasn't new. The iron was rusted. The bars were thick. The lock was heavy and old, and it closed with the sound of something that had been closing on people for a long time. But the placement was new. The cage had been dragged to the center of the main street and positioned so that every window and every door and every boardwalk in the town of Redfield had a clear view. They wanted an audience. That was the point. He'd ridden into Redfield at dusk the evening before, following a road that wound through dry hills and came down into a valley with a creek running through it. Scout had smelled the water from a mile out and pulled toward it, and the stranger had let him go because a horse that's been on dry trail for 2 days earns the right to choose the stop. He'd made camp at the creek, unsaddled Scout, laid out his bedroll, and sat with his back against a cottonwood eating jerky and watching the stars come out one at a time like someone was lighting them. He'd heard them too late. That was the truth of it, and he'd own it. 4 men coming through the brush from the south, moving quiet, boots wrapped in cloth to kill the sound. Professional. They hit him from behind, something hard across the back of his skull, and the stars went sideways and then went out. He woke up in the cage. The sun was high, which meant he'd been unconscious for hours. His head hurt in the deep, pulsing way that meant he'd been hit with something heavy and precise, not a fist, a weapon, wielded by someone who knew where to hit a man to put him down without killing him. His hat was still on. His poncho was still on. His gun belt was gone. That was the first thing he checked, and the first thing he knew. They'd taken the belt, and they'd taken the revolver, and they'd left everything else, because everything else was part of the show. The poncho, the hat. The man in the cage was supposed to look like the man on the road, minus the one thing that made him dangerous. They didn't understand. The gun had never been the thing that made him dangerous. He sat up. The cage was big enough to sit in, but not to stand. The bars were iron, thick as a man's thumb, spaced close enough that he couldn't squeeze through. The lock was on the outside, a padlock the size of a fist, old but solid. He was in the center of the street. The sun was directly overhead. The dirt underneath the cage was already hot. 4 men stood around the cage, 2 on each side, shotguns, held loose, pointed down, the posture of men who'd already won and were enjoying it. They were dressed like bounty hunters, leather coats, good boots, gun belts with multiple weapons, the equipment of men who made their living finding people who didn't want to be found. The one closest to the stranger was lean and sharp-faced, with a scar that ran through his left eyebrow, splitting it in 2. He was chewing tobacco and looking down at the stranger with the expression of a man admiring his own work. "Morning, sunshine," the scarred man said. "Welcome to Redfield." The stranger looked at him, then looked at the other 3, then looked at the cage, then settled back against the bars with his knee up and his arm resting across it and his hat low over his eyes. Comfortable. The way a man sits when he's decided that where he is doesn't concern him as much as it concerns the men outside. "Nice cage," the stranger said. "Mr. Hoyt built it. He builds a lot of things. This town runs the way Mr. Hoyt wants it to run. And right now, Mr. Hoyt wants you in that cage." "What's the bounty?" The scarred man smiled. "No bounty. This is personal. Mr. Hoyt heard you were heading this direction. He heard what you did in Mercer's Gap, what you did in Prescott, what you did in Sutter's Bend. You've been tearing apart operations like his for years, and he decided to stop you before you got here. So he built a cage. He built a cage, and we filled it." The stranger looked at the town through the bars. Redfield was small, a single main street, saloon, livery, general store, church, a few houses, and people, watching from behind curtains and through cracked doors and from the shadows of boardwalks, the way people watch in towns that belong to someone else. Faces everywhere, but no voices. The silence of a town that had been trained to be quiet. "How long has Hoyt been running things here?" the stranger asked. "Long enough. How many families?" The scarred man's smile flickered. "That's not your concern. Everything's my concern. How many families has Hoyt pushed out? You're in a cage, mister. Your concerns have narrowed considerably." The stranger almost smiled. Almost. He settled deeper against the bars and closed his eyes. The 4 bounty hunters looked at each other. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. A man in a cage is supposed to look like a man in a cage. Scared, diminished, desperate. The stranger looked like a man napping on a Sunday afternoon. "He's crazy," one of the other hunters said. "He's not crazy," the scarred man said, but his voice had changed. The confidence had thinned by a fraction. A man who isn't afraid of a cage is either crazy or something worse, and the scarred man was starting to calculate which one it was. The stranger kept his eyes closed. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening. He was cataloging every sound in the town. The creak of a door on the left, someone watching. A child's voice somewhere behind the general store, quickly shushed. The sound of a horse in the livery, shifting weight, hooves on packed dirt. And underneath it all, the hum of a town that was holding information the way a jar holds water, sealed tight, waiting for someone to open the lid. He opened his eyes. A woman was standing at the edge of the boardwalk across the street. Thin, 50s, gray hair pulled back. She was looking at the cage, and her face held something the stranger recognized. Not pity, calculation. She was measuring him the way he measured towns. "Ma'am," the stranger said through the bars, "how many families has Hoyt taken?" The scarred man stepped between them. "Don't talk to her." "I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to her. Ma'am, how many?" The woman looked at the scarred man. Then she looked at the stranger. Then she said, 9. 9 families in 3 years. "Thank you." The scarred man turned on her. "Mrs. Landry," I said, "I heard what you said. I'm 63 years old, and I've been in this town since before your mother was born. You can put a man in a cage, but you can't put my mouth in one." She looked at the stranger. 9 families. My husband was the 10th. He wouldn't sell. He died last year. They said his heart gave out. His heart was fine. His heart was the strongest part of him. The stranger filed that. He filed everything. A man in a cage has nothing but time and information, and the stranger had been collecting both since he opened his eyes. "Your husband's records," the stranger said. "Deed, tax receipts, letters. Where are they?" Mrs. Landry looked at the scarred man. Then she looked at the stranger and said, "In the only place Hoyt never looked, the flour barrel in my kitchen. My husband said hide them in something ordinary. Nobody opens a flour barrel looking for deeds." The scarred man grabbed Mrs. Landry's arm. "That's enough." "Take your hand off her," the stranger said. His voice hadn't changed volume. It hadn't changed tone. But something in it made the scarred man's hand open on its own, the way a hand opens when it touches something hot. The afternoon moved slowly. The sun crossed the sky and the cage got hotter, and the stranger sat in it and watched and listened and waited. People came and went on the boardwalks, quick movements, eyes down, the choreography of a scared town. But they were looking at him, every one of them. Looking at the man in the cage who wasn't acting like a man in a cage, and the looking was doing something to them. It was reminding them of something they'd forgotten. That a man who isn't afraid even when he should be is the most dangerous thing in the world. The barkeep came out at mid-afternoon. A big man named Pruitt with a bald head and a bar towel over his shoulder. He brought a cup of water to the cage and passed it through the bars. The scarred man allowed it because denying water to a man in public view was the kind of thing that turned an audience from scared to angry. "Thank you," the stranger said. Pruitt leaned close. His voice was barely a whisper. "Hoyt's got 14 men. These 4 are the bounty hunters. The other 10 are at the ranch 2 miles south. The lawyer's name is Creed. County clerk in Baxter is bought. $600 a year. Records? Behind the bar. 3 years. Every word Hoyt ever said in my saloon. And he said plenty because the man likes to talk, and a barkeep is the one person every man talks to." "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." Pruitt went back inside. The stranger drank the water and set the cup on the cage floor and went back to waiting. A boy came next, maybe 10 years old. He walked up to the cage from behind the general store and stood there, looking at the stranger with eyes that were too serious for his face. "My mama says you help people. Sometimes. Can you help us?" "I'm in a cage, son." "I know, but mama says the cage doesn't matter. She says you've been in worse." The stranger looked at the boy. "Your mama sounds smart. What's her name?" "Ellen Dawes. My daddy was Patrick Dawes. He had the ranch on Miller Creek. Mr. Hoyt took it last year." "How?" "Mr. Creed brought papers. Daddy couldn't read them. Mama could, but they wouldn't let her see them. Daddy signed something and then the ranch was gone. And then Daddy left to find a lawyer, and he never came back." The stranger looked at the scarred man. The scarred man was looking somewhere else. The particular somewhere else that men look when they're hearing something they already know and don't want to hear again. "Mr. Creed's papers," the stranger said. "Your mama kept copies?" "Mama keeps everything. She keeps it in a box under my bed. She says someday a man will come who needs to see what Mr. Hoyt did. She says the box is more dangerous than a gun. Your mama is right." There were rules on the frontier. The old rules. A man's land was his land. You didn't take it with papers a man couldn't read. You didn't make a woman watch her home get stolen because her husband couldn't understand the words on a page. You didn't put a man in a cage in the middle of a street to scare a town into silence. The code. The unwritten code. It governed everything before men like Hoyt showed up to replace it with lawyers and locked iron. How land was really held. How families were really protected. What happened to men who built cages and thought the cage was the power? The full code. Every rule, every consequence. It's called the Code of the West. It's in the pinned comment. The sun started going down. The shadows got long. The four bounty hunters shifted their weight and checked their shotguns, and the scarred man kept looking at the stranger. And the stranger kept sitting in the cage with his knee up and his hat low, and the calm that was driving every one of them slowly out of their minds. Then Scout came. The horse appeared at the north end of the street like he'd been waiting for the light to change. He walked down the center of the road at a steady pace, head up, ears forward, moving with the particular deliberation of an animal that had a destination and didn't care what was between him and it. The stranger hadn't called him. He didn't need to. Scout always knew. The horse had found him in a canyon once, found him in a snowstorm once, found him bleeding behind a rock in country that didn't have a name. The horse always found him. Scout walked straight to the cage and stopped. He lowered his head and pressed his nose through the bars and breathed warm air on the stranger's face. The stranger put his hand through the bars and touched the horse's neck. "Hey, boy." Scout had something in his mouth, a piece of leather. The stranger took it. It was his gun belt, rolled up, the revolver still in the holster. Scout had found the camp, found where they'd dropped the belt, picked it up and carried it 2 miles through brush and road and brought it to the cage, the way a dog brings a bone to its owner. The scarred man saw the gun belt. His face changed. The other 3 saw it too. The arithmetic that had been comfortable all day, 4 armed men and 1 man in a cage, was no longer comfortable because the man in the cage was now holding a gun through the bars, and the cage that was supposed to be the power had become something else. A position. A fortified position with iron walls and a man inside it who could shoot in every direction and couldn't be reached. "Here's what's going to happen," the stranger said. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't need to. He held it in his lap, casual, like holding a cup of coffee. "You're going to set the key on the ground. You're going to set your shotguns next to it. And you're going to walk south to Mr. Hoyt's ranch and tell him that the cage didn't work." The scarred man looked at the gun, then at the cage, then at the 3 men beside him who were already backing up because the math had flipped and they knew it, and staying wasn't worth what staying used to be worth. "The key," the stranger said. The scarred man reached into his vest and pulled out the key and set it on the ground in front of the cage. He set his shotgun beside it. The other 3 did the same. 4 shotguns in the dirt, 4 men backing away. "Tell Hoyt I'll see him in the morning," the stranger said, "and tell him to bring his lawyer." They walked south, fast. The scarred man looked back once, and the stranger was still sitting in the cage, hadn't even unlocked it yet, still sitting with his knee up and the gun in his lap, and the horse standing beside him. The image would stay with the scarred man for a long time. The man who was more comfortable inside the cage than the men who'd put him there. Mrs. Landry came out first. She picked up the key and unlocked the padlock, and the iron door swung open, and the stranger stepped out and stretched and put the gun belt on and settled it on his hips and tipped his hat to her. "The flour barrel," he said. "I'll get it." The town opened like a fist. Pruitt came out with his notebook. Ellen Dawes came with the box from under her son's bed. Mrs. Landry brought the deed from the flour barrel, still dusted with white, the deed and the tax receipts and the letters her husband had written to every office that would listen, and some that wouldn't. The stranger sat at the bar in Pruitt's saloon and read everything, while the town gathered around him and talked for the first time in 3 years. 9 families. 9 forged claims. A lawyer named Creed who manufactured paper the way a factory manufactured nails. A county clerk in Baxter bought for $600 a year. A man named Hoyt who built cages for people and cages for towns and thought the iron was what held them. He sent 3 telegrams from the relay station before midnight. Federal Land Commission, U.S. Marshal's Office, Territorial Governor. Each telegram contained Pruitt's 3 years of notebook entries, Mrs. Landry's deed and her husband's letters, Ellen Dawes's box of documents, and the names and dates from 9 displaced families. He didn't need to peel Hoyt's men. The bounty hunters had already done it for him. They'd ridden to the ranch and told the 10 men what happened, the horse and the gun belt and the man sitting in the cage holding a revolver like a coffee cup. And by dawn, 7 of the 10 had saddled up and left, because the story was too strange to be a lie and too frightening to test. 3 men left, and Creed, and Hoyt. He found Creed at first light. The lawyer was in his office above the general store, already packing. Not files, personal things. The stranger walked in and Creed looked at him, and the color left his face like water leaving a glass. Open the cabinets, Mr. Creed. Creed opened them without a word. 9 families. 9 forged surveys, manufactured liens, falsified claims. He signed a statement with a hand that shook the way hands shake when a man realizes that the cage he helped build was never going to hold the thing it was built for. The last 3 men left that morning. They saw Creed carrying files to the saloon. They saw Mrs. Landry standing in the middle of the street with flour on her hands and a deed in her grip, and a look on her face that said, "Come and take it." They did the math. Hoyt came at noon. He rode into town on a tall horse with silver-tipped boots and a coat that cost more than most of the houses on this street. He was thin and precise, with a face that had been organized the way his lawyer organized files. Everything in its place, nothing wasted, no expression that hadn't been calculated first. He stopped in the middle of the street and looked at the empty cage and the open door and the 4 shotguns still lying in the dirt where his bounty hunters had left them. The stranger was sitting in a chair on the boardwalk outside the saloon, the same posture, knee up, hat low, except this time the gun belt was on his hip, and the revolver was where it belonged, and the cage was behind him, empty, door open, the lock hanging loose. "You built that cage for me," the stranger said. "I built it to send a message. The message got received, but not the one you intended." The stranger stood up. "Your lawyer opened his files. Your clerk is named in a federal wire. Your bounty hunters left their shotguns in the dirt. 7 of your men rode out before sunrise. The other 3 followed them this morning. You're standing in your own street, Mr. Hoyt, and there's nobody left to stand with you." Hoyt looked at the cage. The empty cage. The cage he'd had built and positioned and planned around, the centerpiece of his control, sitting in the middle of the street with its door hanging open and meaning nothing. 9 families, the stranger said. 3 years. A bought clerk and a crooked lawyer and a cage in the street. That's what you built. And a horse carrying a gun belt in his mouth is what tore it down. He took a step forward. "You have until the federal men arrive. That's more time than you gave Patrick Dawes." Hoyt looked at the stranger. Then he looked at the cage one more time. Then he turned his horse and rode south, and his silver-tipped boots caught the sunlight as he went, and the stranger watched them flash and fade and disappear. The town came out. Mrs. Landry stood next to the cage and put her hand on the bars and then pulled it back and wiped the rust on her dress and said, "Take this thing apart." Pruitt and 3 other men dragged it to the edge of town and left it in the weeds where it belonged. Ellen Dawes stood on the boardwalk with her son. The boy was holding the box that had been under his bed. The box that his mother had told him was more dangerous than a gun. She'd been right. It was. Scout stood at the rail, chewing on a piece of hay like nothing had happened. Like carrying a gun belt 2 miles through brush and delivering it to a man in a cage was just another Tuesday. The stranger walked over and put his hand on the horse's neck, and Scout leaned into it and blew air through his nose. The sound he made when the work was done and the road was waiting. The stranger mounted up. The horse turned north before the stranger was fully in the saddle. That easy trot that covered miles without announcing them. The boy ran to the edge of the boardwalk. "Mister, your mama was right." The stranger looked back. "About what?" "The cage doesn't matter." The stranger tipped his hat and rode. Mrs. Landry was already writing letters. 9 families, 9 addresses. "Come home. The cage is gone. Bring your deeds, the real ones. I'll see you on the road." And the code the stranger carries, the one Mr. Landry hid in a flour barrel because ordinary things protect extraordinary truths. The one Patrick Dawes tried to fight with a signature he couldn't read. The one a 10-year-old boy kept under his bed because his mother told him it was more dangerous than a gun. That's in the pinned comment.